On a quiet autumn evening, in the outskirts of the small town of Willow Creek, the air was thick with a chill that matched the tension in the Richardson home. Inside, the once cozy bungalow felt colder than the wind outside, especially in the presence of Mary and Richard Richardson. They had been married for 20 years, their relationship defined by unspoken rules and silences, rather than love and passion. Mary, a 44-year-old homemaker, had once dreamed of a life filled with adventure, but those dreams had been buried long ago under layers of routine and disappointment. Richard, a 47-year-old insurance salesman, was a man who took pride in his thriftiness and discipline, traits that had earned him respect in the community, but left little room for warmth at home. Their conversations had dwindled over the years, reduced to brief exchanges about bills, errands, and weather. But everything changed when Richard inherited his father's wealth, an unexpected windfall that included a sizable life insurance policy and a family estate worth millions. Mary had hoped that this sudden fortune would breathe new life into their marriage, perhaps reignite some of the affection they had once shared. Instead, Richard became more secretive, even possessive about their newfound wealth, and spent long hours in his study, reviewing legal documents and making calls. One night, as the clock struck midnight, Mary found herself awake, staring at the ceiling in the darkness. A thought crept into her mind, one that she quickly pushed away, but it lingered like a shadow in the corner of the room. The money could be hers, the house, the estate, everything, without Richard. The next morning she began to plan. She read about poisons on the internet, about how small doses could mimic a heart attack if administered slowly over time. She started slipping tiny amounts of a tasteless toxin into Richard's evening tea. Days turned into weeks, and she watched as Richard grew pale and weak, his complaints of chest pains dismissed as stress from managing the inheritance. One rainy night, Richard doubled over in pain after dinner, clutching his chest as he gasped for breath. Mary remained by his side, her voice soothing even as she dialed for the ambulance with deliberate slowness. "Hang on, love," she whispered, the words dripping with false concern as she held his hand, feeling his grip weaken. By the time the paramedics arrived, Richard was gone. The doctors attributed it to a heart attack, a sudden tragedy that seemed to fit the narrative of his declining health. The funeral was small, attended by neighbors who whispered about the tragedy that had struck the Richardson family. Mary, draped in black, played the role of the grieving widow perfectly, her tears convincing even to herself. In the weeks that followed, she moved swiftly to settle Richard's estate, selling off the family home and consolidating the wealth into her own accounts. It seemed that her plan had gone off without a hitch. But just as she began to envision a future of luxury and freedom, there was a knock on her door one evening. Detective Harris, a sharp-eyed investigator from the county, stood on her porch. "We've been going through the toxicology reports, Mrs. Richardson," he said, his voice steady. Mary's heart froze. "There are some anomalies we need to discuss." Her mind raced, scrambling for an explanation, but as Harris continued to speak, she realized there would be no easy escape. The autopsy had revealed traces of poison in Richard's system, enough to raise suspicion, especially given the timing of his death and Mary's sudden claim to the inheritance. Within days, she found herself in a cold interrogation room, confronted with the evidence of her carefully laid plan. Mary's once steely resolve crumbled under the weight of the questions, the accusation, and the realization that her secret was out. In a matter of hours, the life she had imagined for herself disappeared, replaced by the stark reality of a prison cell. As she sat in the darkness, the irony struck her. She had gained everything she thought she wanted, only to lose everything that truly mattered in the end. Following Mary's arrest, The story of Richard Richardson's demise and the sinister plot behind it quickly spread through Willow Creek. Neighbors who had once offered their condolences now whispered in hushed tones about the woman they had thought they knew. The media labeled Mary as the Black Widow of Willow Creek, a nickname that further solidified her infamy. Inside the county jail, Mary spent her days in a gray cell, the silence pressing against her like a heavy weight. She kept her head down, unwilling to meet the eyes of the other inmates or the guards, who sometimes threw pitying or judgmental glances her way. Her thoughts were consumed by the events that had led her here, the choices that seemed so rational at the time, but now felt like the desperate actions of a woman who had lost herself long before she had lost her freedom. The court proceedings were swift. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Richard's toxicology report, records of her internet searches, and a journal entry found hidden in the Richardson home, where Mary had scribbled down her frustrations and desires for a different life. The prosecution painted a picture of a cold-hearted woman who had betrayed her husband's trust for financial gain. The defense tried to argue diminished responsibility, suggesting that years of emotional neglect had driven Mary to a breaking point, but the jury remained unmoved, and after 3 days of deliberation, they delivered a guilty verdict. The judge's words echoed in the courtroom, announcing a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Mary listened in a daze, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, but she showed little reaction as she was led away. As the gavel struck, it marked not just the end of the trial, but the end of everything she had known. Back in her cell, time seemed to stretch endlessly, each day blending into the next. Mary's mind became her worst enemy, replaying the final moments of Richard's life over and over, haunted by the look in his eyes as he gasped for air. She tried to tell herself that she had acted out of necessity, that she had deserved a better life than the one she had, but the justifications rang hollow in the stillness of her cell. Months passed, and Mary received few visitors. Only her sister came occasionally, her face drawn with disappointment and sadness as she sat across from Mary in the visitation room, trying to find the sister she once knew in the hollowed-out woman before her. Those visits became shorter and less frequent until they stopped altogether. Alone, Mary began to write, filling notebooks with reflections on her life, regrets, and the strange sense of relief she felt now that she no longer had to pretend. One stormy night, Mary sat on the edge of her cot, staring out through the bars at the rain battering the small window high up on the wall. She thought about the future she would never have, trips she had dreamed of, dinners at fancy restaurants, the taste of freedom. She had imagined, but never truly understood. She wondered what Richard would have done if their roles had been reversed, if he had been the one trapped in a loveless marriage, with the promise of wealth just out of reach. But deep down, she knew that Richard, for all his flaws, would never have crossed the line she had. As the storm raged outside, Mary made a decision. The next morning, she requested to see Detective Harris, the man who had led the investigation against her. She met him in the same stark interrogation room where she had first heard the evidence against her. His expression was cautious, his eyes searching hers for a sign of the change he sensed. "I want to confess," Mary said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Not just to what I did, but to why I did it. People need to know the truth about what happens when you give up on yourself, when you let bitterness take over." Harris listened in silence as Mary poured out the story of her life with Richard, the disappointments, the disillusionment, and the moment when she had let her desire for freedom eclipse any sense of morality. For the first time, she spoke not just of her hatred and resentment, but of the guilt that had gnawed at her ever since Richard's final breath left his body. The detective remained impassive, but he nodded once when she finished. "I'll make sure it's included in the record," he said simply, before standing to leave. As he walked out, he paused, glancing back at Mary. "Maybe someday someone will understand why you did it, but that doesn't make it right." Mary knew he was right, and as the door closed behind him, she felt a strange sense of peace, as if finally she had let go of a burden she had carried for far too long. For the first time, the walls of her cell felt less like a prison and more like a place where she could confront herself without the lies. Years later, when news of Mary's death from natural causes reached the town, the whispers resurfaced, but with a different tone. Some said that she had paid the price for her greed. Others, perhaps remembering the loneliness they had seen in her eyes, spoke of a woman who had been trapped in a life she couldn't escape until it was too late. But in the end, the details of Mary Richardson's life faded into the background of Willow Creek's history, leaving behind only the memory of a tragedy that could have been avoided, if only someone had seen the cracks before it was too late. As the years passed, the memory of Mary Richardson and her crime faded from the minds of Willow Creek's residents, leaving behind a cautionary tale that was whispered among neighbors but rarely spoken of aloud. The house where she and Richard had lived was sold, remodeled, and eventually occupied by a new family who knew little of its dark history. But for Mary, the past never faded. It clung to her like the shadows of her cell. In the starkness of her solitary life, Mary found solace in routine. She worked in the prison library, organizing books and keeping to herself. She began corresponding with a prison chaplain, though she never fully embraced the idea of forgiveness. Instead, their talks became a way for her to confront her regrets without seeking redemption, to acknowledge her own failings without expecting absolution. It was in those conversations that she finally admitted the full extent of her loneliness, her desperation, and the misguided hope that freedom, no matter the cost, would fill the void inside her. One chilly autumn morning, Mary woke feeling weaker than usual. Her body had been failing for some time, but she hadn't mentioned it to the guards or medical staff. It seemed fitting, in a way, that she should slip away quietly, just as she had tried to live in the years before the crime. As she lay in the thin bed, her breath coming in shallow gasps, she thought back to that rainy night when she had sat by Richard's side as he died. She had believed she was watching him slip away, but now she understood that she had been losing herself long before. The last thoughts that crossed her mind were not of the life she had tried to steal for herself, but of the small moments she had once shared with Richard before the resentment set in. Watching the sunrise together on their porch, laughing over a silly joke he had made at a dinner party. Memories she had buried now rose unbidden, and she found herself clinging to them, trying to remember the woman she had once been before she had allowed bitterness to poison her heart. In the end, there was no grand gesture, no final confession that would change the story of what she had done. There was just silence. As Mary slipped into the darkness, with the first hint of dawn creeping through the barred window. Later that day, when the guards discovered her body, they found a small notebook clutched in her hands, its pages filled with her reflections, confessions, and regrets. The chaplain, upon hearing of her passing, was given the notebook. He read through her writings, noting the shifts from anger to sorrow, and finally, to a strange kind of acceptance. It was clear that Mary had come to understand her actions and their impact, even if she had never forgiven herself. The notebook was filed away with the rest of Mary's belongings, a memento that few would ever read. But for those who did, it told the story of a woman who had sought freedom at any cost, only to find that the price was far greater than she had imagined. In Willow Creek, life moved on. The town grew, new families moved in, and Mary Richardson's name became a footnote in local history, a tragic figure whose story had lost its immediacy, but lingered as a quiet reminder of what happens when hope turns to desperation. The old Richardson house, once a symbol of wealth and aspiration, became just another home, the past buried beneath new paint and fresh memories. But sometimes, on particularly stormy nights, when the wind howled through the trees and rain lashed against the windows, a few of the older residents would remember the night Richard died and the look in Mary's eyes as she was led away. They would think of the choices that had led to that fateful day and wonder, in their own quiet moments, what they might have done differently had they seen the loneliness that lurked beneath Mary's composed exterior. In the end, Mary's story was not one of redemption or justice, but of a cautionary tale, a reminder that sometimes the greatest prisons are the ones we build for ourselves. And as the last remnants of her life faded into the fog of memory, the town of Willow Creek continued, carrying forward the lessons that would be passed down in hushed conversations and knowing glances, long after the world had forgotten the woman who had sought everything and lost it all.